This episode is supported by MonsterJoysticks.com. Level up your Raspberry Pi with our all-in-one arcade kit using genuine Sanwa arcade parts. And OneClickPrint.com for your photos on canvas, acrylic, gifts and more. Local craftsmen and global delivery.
Hello cave dwellers, it's time again for another Trash to Treasure, and we've got the Amiga A1500 out for part 3 of the series. My favourite part of the series. It's the time when we really stretch its legs, put some upgrades in and see what it was capable of, using parts that perhaps I couldn't really afford at the time, but I've managed to get hold of now. Now, just to recap, as much for my benefit as perhaps for yours, in part 1 we found that the CPU socket had suffered corrosion and we had to swap that out. This, remember, on a system that was bought as working, so we had a few surprises when we found that it actually wasn't. The CPU socket was swapped out. In part 2 we then found that there were problems with the audio circuit and had to add new traces to circumvent the problems that we found there. And we also gave it a good clean up, ready for a live stream. We then had the Amiga at the Movies live stream featuring special guest Oliver Harper, and we really put it through its paces in its stock condition, albeit with the addition of the GoTech floppy emulator. So that satisfied me that our fixes were good, the machine's all working in stock condition, and now it's time for these upgrades. So let me show you what I've got on the table here, because what I want to do today is follow a slightly more classical upgrade path using period parts rather than modern parts, and I'll tell you why, and I'll take you through them now. Let's take a look.
Let's start with the big guns then, and it's the Apollo 2030 Turbo by ACT or ACT Electronic in Germany. This was released in 1991. This accelerator gives us a Motorola 68030 CPU running at 50 MHz and a 68882 floating point unit at the same speed. Compared to our stock 7 MHz, this should be blazingly fast. It also has 2 RAM slots, and I've got 32 meg of a maximum 64 installed. Again, that's a big leap from the stock 1 meg. You can also attach a SCSI device. It really is the Swiss Army knife of upgrades, but I won't be using that on account of the next upgrade we have here. Following your heart and not logic is part of the joy of upgrading RetroKit. This Commodore Flyer lists the kind of hardware we'd have drooled over. Hardware like the A2091 SCSI controller, which we have right here. Yes, there are modern alternatives for IDE devices, compact flash card adapters and such like, but you know what? In this build I don't want any artificial flavourings. I want to hear the spinning up of that quantum fireball hard disk in precisely the way I would have experienced it in '91, had I been able to afford it, and I want to hear it chuntering away in time to a flashing hard disk light. Okay, if we're being pedantic, the fireball range of discs didn't come out until '95, but you understand what I'm trying to achieve here. A key chip to this card is the custom Commodore DMAC chip, and the same chip is found on board the A3000 and 4000T for the same SCSI purposes. The ROMs on the board have also been updated to Cloanto licensed version 7 ROMs, which handily allow the use of drives over 1 gig in size. There's also RAM on board, which enables DMA or direct memory access, speeding up our data requests. On the back we've got an external SCSI port, and that could come in handy. We can attach up to 7 devices in total. An external CD-ROM drive perhaps in future. Another ROM upgrade, and this time it's the Kickstart ROM. We're jumping from 1.3 to 3.1, again supplied by Cloanto under license. Surprisingly, a new 3.1.4 ROM has recently been released, offering things such as larger hard disk support. But I think for my classic build, 3.1 is just fine, and it keeps it authentic. If there's one thing I have to concede on, well yes, it's floppy drives. More and more of my original disks are failing, and to get around that we do need to use a GoTech floppy emulator, but I'll also keep one of the original drives in.
So those are the parts I'm fitting today. I think what we should do now is benchmark the system in stock condition very quickly. I'll show you those results briefly, but we will come back to them and run a side-by-side after the installation so we can see exactly the difference that these upgrades have made and hopefully get a nice surprise.
Okay, benchmark fans, let's see what this is made of. Starting with speed, which should come as no surprise. It's on a par with the A500, 600, 2000 and the other Amigas sharing the 7MHz 68000 CPU, clocking up 0.57 MIPS. So if you bought yourself a stock A1500 over an A500 and didn't upgrade it, well, it wasn't really money well spent, put it that way. Over here we see the ECS Agnes chip installed and the standard Denise chip. The 68000 CPU at 7.09 MHz as this is running in PAL mode, and the comment, getting better. The memory page shows we've just got the standard 1 meg of onboard chip RAM. The Amiga, remember, has chip and fast RAM. Chip RAM shared between the chips and fast RAM being accessed exclusively by the CPU, but we haven't got any of that installed. In the drives panel, well, it's only our floppy disk drive, and this should show two of them, but one isn't attached at the moment, so we've just got DF0 showing. And in the boards page, we've got no additional boards fitted at this time. Some real-world tests now, and I'll show them quickly as we'll come back to them for the side-by-side comparison. Frontier is a favourite for benchmarking, and you can see why. I can't actually believe I bought this on release, and I enjoyed it at this frame rate on my stock A500. At times it must hit half a frame per second, like here when the ship's landing down on the planet. Vista is not just a universally loathed operating system, it's also a fractal landscape generator, so we'll render a scene, and I suspect the maths coprocessor on the Apollo card will make a big difference here when we compare. And another game I played and loved on my stock A500, it's Chris Roberts' Wing Commander. A combination of 3D space and sprite work trickery, as well as cinematic cutscenes, really pushed the Amiga to the limit. This game was a real showcase for the power of PCs at the time, so it would be nice to see if the Amiga can do any better with its speed, if not for the increased colour palette that the PC had over it.
Stock results then, they shouldn't come as any surprise to anyone. On a par with the Amiga 600, Amiga 500, stock Amiga 2000, which is of course is what the A1500 is. So that wouldn't have surprised you. But hopefully we'll get a nice surprise when we put these upgrades in. So let's grab the screwdriver and put them in one by one and see what difference they make.
The GoTech goes in first then. This A1500 has two floppy drives installed, and I'm going to replace one with the GoTech floppy emulator. As there are two drives, I've got a floppy cable which supports this configuration, but if you've got a single drive model then you might need to find yourself another cable that supports two drives. The mount for the PSU and the drives lifts right out, making it a lot easier to work on without dropping screws on the system board. And the drives themselves sit on standoffs, which can be a little bit stubborn to release, but with a little bit of persuasion the drives will come free, and then the GoTech can be fitted using those same standoffs. There is space to align the drives to get a nice fit horizontally, but this doesn't quite work out as planned, as we'll see in a moment. Now I want my GoTech to be the primary or DF0 drive, and the floppy drive to be DF1. To achieve this, you'll want to make sure the jumper on the floppy drive you want to be DF1 is on the bottom left 2 pins as shown here. You'll also want to make sure jumper 301 is closed on the system board, which mine is already as it was a 2-drive setup. And then I ran into a problem which may save you some time if you're aware of it. The floppy and GoTech power ports are on opposite sides, so swapping the drives around would allow the power cable to plug into both of them. In this configuration they don't reach. I'd swap them around now, but I also noticed there's a cosmetic problem, so I've decided to forge on with testing using only the GoTech, and then I'll show you exactly what I mean and we'll address it after testing. and that does work exactly as it should, loading ADF files from the USB stick at floppy drive speeds. You don't get any kind of performance increase out of this, only convenience and of course reliability. Next up it's the Kickstart ROM, and this is a really easy part to replace. We pop the chip out of the socket, preferably using a removal tool and not a screwdriver, which could accidentally damage the board, and then we put the 3.1 ROM in. A quick power on test then shows the distinctive purple splash screen of the 3.1 ROM, and that's working perfectly fine. Now then, it's Apollo time, and surprisingly it's a quick installation process for such a big upgrade. There's no thermal paste or heat sinks required here. I did forget to show you earlier that if I pop the RAM out, there you go, you can see the 2030 turbo lettering in great big white letters, a bit like a turbo badge on the back of a family estate. It makes all the difference, of course. There's two jumpers on the card which can enable the RAM and SCSI functionality, and they're set accordingly here, and then you can see front side written on the card, in case we're in any doubt as to which way round it goes. The card then slides into the CPU slot, and we don't need to remove the old CPU or anything like that, it just slots straight in. And while the Amiga's build quality isn't anything to shout about, the inclusion of guide slots to slide home expansion boards is a nice touch. And those guides are even more helpful when you have a full-length card like the A2091, a beast that you really want to be securely in place. The drive doesn't have to be mounted on the card, you can just as easily mount it in the case drive bay, but I quite like it on the card all as one unit. Should this drive fail, then a SCSI to SD adapter is of course an option, which will allow me to continue using the card with a modern twist. There again is the DMAC chip, which will automatically utilise RAM on the board if it's present, and it looks like we've got 16 Oki branded RAM chips, so we'll let sysinfo tell us if they're working and exactly how much is usable. We've also got SCSI LED pins there, so hopefully we can get the hard drive light blinking away on the front of the case. With the card installed, it all seems quite positive. It turns on, it boots up, and there is a fairly clean workbench installed present on the drive from the previous owner, which is fine for testing today. I will of course customise that at a later point. But my hard drive light wasn't working, and I found by moving us along a pin, like so, we were able to get our flashy flashes flashing correctly. No real drama then so far, which means it's time to dive into the benchmarks again and see exactly what effect the upgrades have had on our system. Well, it's all looking good. We now have a 512K Kickstart ROM showing V40, where previously it was 256K and version 34, so that's our 3.1 ROM. On the right here we've got our 68030 CPU and the 68882 FPU, so let's hit the speed button and see what happens. These are our new results, and it's a huge performance boost, 50 MHz of raw Amiga power, destroying all the stock OCS ECS machines and beaten only by the 68040 of the A4000. MIPS are up to 6.58, and if we bring the old results back on screen, you can see the difference. Now this isn't the huge increase you might see from a Vampire card for example, but for an of the period upgrade, I'm happy, and sysinfo is certainly happy, asking me if I can smell the rubber. In memory, we're now seeing 32 MB on our Apollo card. It also detects 1 meg on the A2091 SCSI card, and of course we've got the 1 meg of onboard chip RAM. All of our boards are correctly showing up. And the quantum fireball disk with 1222 megs of capacity is also showing, and that's a lot more than the 40 meg advertised on that Commodore leaflet. So everything appears to be working, but what does it look like in our real world tests? Well, let's compare. Frontier here is running from the floppy or floppy emulator, so there's no loading advantage, but the frame rate difference is night and day. Our upgraded Amiga is silky smooth and it handles complex scenes such as landing on the planet with absolute ease. This clearly then how the game was intended to be played and enjoyed, and not the slideshow I endured, although admitted earlier, still enjoyed. Let's turn to fractal landscapes then and see how much difference the more powerful CPU and the additional floating point unit make to our render times. We're rendering exactly the same scene on each configuration, and I've hit render at the same moment, setting them to work, so let's see what happens. There really is no contest, is there? Our stock Amiga, which I'll now fast forward the capture on so you can actually see it complete, took 2 minutes and 45 seconds to render. In comparison, the upgraded machine took just 25 seconds. That Apollo accelerator really flexing its muscles over the stock machine. The hard disk too is making a big difference to my enjoyment of this machine, and that's evident in Wing Commander, which I've installed on the upgraded machine's hard disk. It's running from floppy disk on the stock machine. From launching our ship you can see how much smoother the graphics move, but notice how long it takes for the stars and space itself to appear on the stock machine. This is a period of loading from floppy disk. By the time we have control, we're already at the first waypoint and in a firefight with the Kilrathi on the upgraded machine. And look at the speed of the laser cannons, they're painfully slow on the stock machine. It's admirable that Origin chose the stock specification to publish this title on, and a technical achievement for sure, but it's much more enjoyable now with the accelerated machine. So I'm happy with the performance gains I've achieved. It's time now to tidy up the build and put some finishing touches on it. The gap you can see around the Gotek device combined with the real floppy drive not being connected, that's just not good enough. So to tidy that up, I've used a regular PC 3.5 to 5.25 inch bay mount. The Gotek slides nicely into that, and the advantage of positioning the Gotek here is that the floppy power cable now reaches both devices and they're both working, as you can see on the screen here. Smarty paints on our floppy and the Workbench Icons disc is mounted on the Gotek, and they're both showing up on the screen. My desire to be able to disk copy from the Gotek to real media, that works just great most of the time when I don't have a broken old floppy disk in the drive. And I think you'll agree that this configuration looks a lot nicer than it did before, but something has been bugging me for the entire duration of this series, and perhaps you too. It's that wonky Commodore 1500 sticker. Seriously Commodore, this retailed at £999, how is that in any way acceptable? Thankfully I found a man who creates new replacements to a very high standard, not just for the 1500 but for every model of Amiga computer out there. So if you're in the market for new labels, then do check out the link in the video description to get yourself some, because I think this tiny change makes a big difference to the quality of the build finish. All that really remains on my shopping list now is a genuine Commodore monitor, as that really would be the cherry on top. But even through a modern monitor with an OSSC upscaler, I think you'll agree it looks pretty good.
That then is our Amiga 1500. It's really singing now with that accelerator card in there, and with the hard disk in there we've done away with the floppy load times. It's just a really nice machine to work with and indeed to look at. Now, the more observant of you will have noticed that something changed halfway through that rebuild, and it was this. The power supply unit went pop and refused to give us 5 volts anymore. So I swapped it out with an existing A2000 power supply that I had, but it raises questions. That's not getting any newer. As with other parts in the machine, it will go pop eventually, like this one did. And instead of repairing it, perhaps we should use the casing to put a modern PC power supply in there and then adapt it to work with the Amiga. I'm sure it can't be too difficult, so I think we should do an episode on that in the near future. But not just yet, because I've got a lot of playing to do, a lot of catching up to do, and a lot of enjoyment to be had out of this A1500, I think. Let me know in the comments what you'd like to see running on it. I'm quite inclined to make an episode about the best ECS, OCS games that benefit from an accelerator. I think that might be an enjoyable episode to share with you. I don't normally do top 5s or top 10s, but that one might be a bit interesting. Let me know your thoughts, and as always, thank you for watching and take care.
If you enjoy my content and would like to toss a coin into the hat to support the cave, then check out patreon.com/retromancave and join the official cave dwellers you can see on the screen now. Thank you for your support.